Welcome back, everyone, to Afrodo Reviews, and on this channel, I help you decide. Is that book worth reading of a second breakfast? Or does it deserve the fiery pits of Mount Doom? Welcome back, everyone. Today's book is The Titan's Curse, the third entry in the Percy Jackson and the Olympians series, the flagship franchise of author Rick Riordan, to begin what would become known as the Riordanverse. I have several of those books, by the way. I'll eventually dig into them, but for now, keep moving on this one. This book was first published on May 5th of 2007, and as far as I know, has not won any literary awards, though it was nominated for something. I'm not sure if I'm getting a translated to Spanish version of the award, or this was just an award I never heard of, but hey, it's something. But it was also nominated for a Quill Award. I can thankfully say that this is where the movie adaptations of this book also officially fell off, as the last two books in this franchise I reviewed, I had to unfortunately remind everybody that there was a live-action movie adaptation. This will only be adapted into live action for the first time in the third season of the Disney Plus series, which I have heard is a much better and more faithful adaptation of this work. Which, thank God, I honestly do not know how the live actions would have continued with their plot, considering the massive amount of changes, not just in the first movie, but the second movie most assuredly. One day I'll go through to why those are such terrible adaptations, but for now, there isn't much else in the terms of backgrounds that I could find, so here's the ratings card. And we'll go ahead and move on to the cover. Now, I forgot where I placed the book. I've done that more than once on this channel. It's floating around here in my apartment somewhere. I'll find it somewhere, but for now, I'll just superimpose a picture of the cover I have right here. Now, I have the original cover of the work, which obviously makes sense as this is one of the oldest books in my entire shelf. Like I said, I had this book about the same time they released Battle of the Labyrinth. And personally, I love this cover. I acknowledge that a part of that is definitely the nostalgic bias for me, considering this was a cover that drew the young Afrodo into one of his most loved franchises as a teenager. Actually, not even a teenager. I was still in 7th grade at that point, so I was actually closer to 12 still. I'll go through the math some other day and tell you the actual age. It's been over a decade now. I'm getting old. But I would like to think that even outside of it, the cover is genuinely amazing. I mean, we got our main character, Percy Jackson, atop his loyal Pegasus steed, Blackjack, as they rest on a skyscraper in Manhattan. Grapevines wrap around them, much to their shock. Now, I do love this cover because right away, it sells you on 3 things. The first, this is an urban fantasy. 2, it's dealing with Greek myth. And 3, there's some looming danger that Percy Jackson has to stop. It also has a scene directly lifted from the book, which gives it extra credit for me always. I always prefer scenes from the book to be drawn as the cover rather than just some random collage of images. Especially when those images have nothing to do with the overall story. Now, if I wanted to be nitpicky on this cover, though, which I feel is only fair considering my glowing praise and nostalgia for this book, I would say that of all the scenes to use out of the book, this is one of the stranger ones. Blackjack isn't really a very strong character in this book, as he's more of a plot device and comedic relief in the scenes he's in. The reason Percy Jackson is able to go along on the quest when he otherwise wouldn't, and the reason he can finish the quest at the end. And the scene where we see them getting tangled up with grapevines, while a great character moment, isn't actually directly related to the events of this book. It does, like I said, it's a great character moment for someone, but it's not really relevant in the long run of this specific story. In the longer scene of things, the scene is very important, but not this one. But what is this book about, I hear you ask? Well, for those curious to see how the book presents itself, I recommend checking out my July TBR, which will be linked below. There, I read the back of the book and give you a basic rundown of what I remember of the story myself from the last time I read it years ago. As I've said before, I think reading the synopsis on the back of the book is pretty important, as it helps set the foundation of the expectations you go into a book with. In addition, you should also check out my previous 2 videos on the earlier entries of the franchise, The Lightning Thief and The Sea of Monsters. I probably won't put the pictures up, because overall, some context is relevant from them into here. But for the sake of context on this specific book, after a botched mission by Percy Jackson and his friends, his best friend, Annabeth Chase, has gone missing, and Percy finds himself in the unfortunate position of not being able to go after her. However, after a quest comes in to save the lost goddess Artemis, who Percy suspects is in the same place as Annabeth, Percy knows he can't be left behind, and is determined to follow along at any cost, even if it means teaming up with the man-hating hunters who serve Artemis. Even though the prophecy of this quest predicts more than one person of this group is going to die. And honestly, I feel that's good enough to really talk about what I want to talk about in this book. It's hard to really give any more of the synopsis without giving more spoilers. I do think the back of the book, as mentioned in my TBR, does give something of a false expectation of this book, as it suggests the military school setting at the very beginning is a much bigger setting than it is in this thing. But by chapter 3, they're largely out of the school, and the story is much more about this quest that I mentioned, rather than them being in the military school. I do remember even having that same misunderstanding when I was a kid. But the question here is, does this book still hold up? Well, let's take off the rose-tinted glasses and confidently say, yeah, it does. Well, I have admitted before that the story truly invested me in the Percy Jackson and the Olympians story by the simple merit that it's the first one I read. I can definitely see why it did. Because this is the book I feel like the series really grows its beard, where Riordan really pulls off the kid's glove and starts to weave the story in the way that you can tell that he has an endgame plan. But he's also got the next book planned, and the story elements he's gonna, even the minor ones, he's gonna put into the following books. You get that sense that he's definitely working his way to something big now. Which is fair, because, book 3 of 5. But the previous 2 works can stand almost entirely by themselves without really any acknowledgement there's this overarching theme. This book feels like you need to understand there's an overarching theme. Having read all the way to the end of the next series that follows this one, this book really does hold up. There was even going to be a moment where I joked about how this book sort of proved that Riordan hadn't planned to do the Greek-Roman split personalities for the gods, because there's a joke that the god Apollo makes in here about his time in the Roman Empire. But then I remembered Apollo is the same in both pantheons. He's one of the few characters like Nike who would actually basically remain the same between the Greek-Roman split. But back to my gushing. I saw this book really elevate, not just because we see the plot threads leading to the Battle of the Labyrinth, which is the 4th book in the series, because of the subsequent finale of the series, which I'm excited to eventually review during one of these Julys, The Last Olympian. We see characters who up until this point had sort of served as a one-note character show their hidden depths. We see character progression both internally and externally for our main group. We see plot threads of Pan, which has been Grover's goal since the 1st book, coming back around, rather than just being constant teases. There's so much in this book that genuinely feels like it's building up to this big, loving crescendo of a finale. But that's not to say that the book doesn't stand on its own as well. We get a great scene where we finally meet Annabeth's father, and he, as a mortal, fights off monsters in an incredibly unique way. We see Percy struggle with his jealousy and his pride, which he feels inferior to his friends before eventually coming around to making the right choice despite those things. We see Grover advancing his own personality, from his lovably fawning over Artemis and her hunters, to his search of Pan finally advancing in a significant way. We see Thalia and Percy, the children of the 2 strongest gods, clashing with each other while also being good friends. It's a very good continuation of the story we left off last time. To some extent. Now, I say this because reading this book back, there are a couple of things where I had to stop and remind myself, yeah, this was a kid's book. That, as a kid, I wouldn't really have noticed anything wrong with it, at least not on a bigger plane than, ew, I don't like that. But as an adult, I do kind of realize these scenes give off wrong vibes. A minor one is the god Apollo is flirting with what we, as an audience member at this point in time, think is a girl who can't be more than 16. And has to be told off by his sister not to flirt with any of her hunters, which, from the story itself, range between the ages of 12 and 16, with most of them being more in the middle. It feels weird to say this, but it almost kind of falls into that 1,000-year-old lolly debate, which I hate. But this is somewhat forgivable, at least, because we learn the truth of that character's parentage, which does kind of excuse it. It's not... That being said, I'm not fond of it, but even apart from that being said, the siblings of the Sun and Moon have sort of soured, in my opinion, as I reread through this. For example, I really, really did not like Artemis and her hunters on this read-through. Not because I find her personally bad or as an annoying character. Riordan does barely manage to find the right balance between her misandric beliefs and a likable personality that, in a vacuum, you sort of forget that she does things like happily talk a lot about how she loves transforming men into animals that she's going to hunt. Plus, she's a Greek god, and you know how they were. Ruthless to humans, your crew is like the clash of the douches! But the thing that really bothered me about Artemis is, her hunters. You see, in the beginning of the chapters of this novel, we're introduced to the hunter concept, which are a group of women who pledge their lives to Artemis and maidenhood, in return for not only immortality, but becoming badass woman archers, basically like the Amazons of myth. Now, casting aside that the debate about just what ancient Greeks mean by the concept of maidenhood, the reason that this bothers me so much is, Percy says that the oldest hunters in the group that he can see are about his age, with a few being mentioned as being being older than him by 1 or 2 years, but most being younger than him. And a reminder, Percy is 14 years old in this book. This means that Artemis goes around the country, goes around the world, really, convincing girls who are between the ages of 12 and 13 en masse to join her in an immortal hunt of monsters, while also fostering them in a massively misandrist environment where Percy genuinely notes that he's uncomfortable being around the sheer amount of hate he's getting just for being a boy who happened to stumble across them. At one point, we see them joking with Artemis about turning men into animals that are going to be hunted for sport. This gets even worse when you look at the fact that, I don't know if it was really true at the time, to be fair, but modern days, Artemis has very heavy sapphic coding. And this is probably furthered by, in the story itself, Artemis, who not only seems to recruit mostly prepubescent girls into her misandrist cult, but she also likes to cosplay as a 12-year-old. To put it another way, a grown woman pretending to be a little girl roams the country recruiting other little girls, arming them with weapons, and then teaching them to hate men while hunting dangerous monsters who can kill them. One who has a cultural following who sees her as a sapphic icon.
No, don't like that.
And I think a part of the reason that I feel this way on a reread is I realize just how insidious it feels when they recruit Bianca D'Angelo, Nico's sister, in this book. After they rescue her and her brother from the Manticore, they swiftly descend on Bianca, barely giving her any time to recover from the shock of an attack from a real-life monster, something she didn't know existed before this moment, one who just tried to kill her and her brother, but also from the fact that she's a half-god, that she is born of something she thought was a myth. They immediately isolate her from anyone who would try to talk her out of joining the club, and then proceed to convince her to abandon her brother to join an immortal hunt at the ripe old age of 14. Where Not only will she watch her younger brother grow old and die while she remains 14 forever, but she basically has to hate men for the rest of her life. And I'll give Riordan does give some lip service to the idea that Bianca joined for reasons that she just doesn't want to care for Nico anymore. She doesn't want to be his mother, effectively. She wants to live her own life. It still feels very wrong and dirty. I'm perfectly aware that this is largely an older, more mature me looking back at something and realizing how weird it feels in an adult context. And again, more than once I had to remind myself this was written for kids. But I will say that even as a kid, the misandrous part of the cult really did bother me a lot. I do remember feeling confused as a kid if I was supposed to like the Hunters or hate them at the end. Because Bianca never shows the misandrous attitudes, but she's their freshest recruit by only a couple days. And Zoe's attitude gives perfect sense when you learn the context of why she hates men so much. But that doesn't really excuse the rest of the Hunters or Artemis, who get far less characterization. It's just something that as an adult I felt uncomfortable and wished it was handled with a little more tact, all things considered. It's just one of those, as a kid, you don't question it, but as an adult, you're like, ooh, that's creepy. Okay, so before I go on, I'm going to give a quick spoiler warning for talk about another issue. I do spoil something that happens at the end of the book, and if you prefer to go in with, no spoilers in mind, I would heavily recommend skipping to the conclusion. It's mostly about one point, but it is only fair that I give you that warning. But anyways, another issue I have, something that I had even as a kid when I read this series for the first time and realized Thalia only has a prominent role in this book. And looking back on it now, rereading it, it does sort of feel like Riordan didn't really have a plan for Thalia. At least maybe he didn't have a current plan for her when he wrote the story. If you read a story in this, it feels odd. Thalia starts off the book hating the Hunters, not just because they wanted her to abandon her friends, but refused to help her and spewed awful things about Luke, one of the main antagonists of the series, when he was still basically her adopted brother and they were best friends. Throughout the entire book, she shows great contempt for them, though mildly softens to Zoe specifically as they get along a bit. However, despite showing some hints of softening up, Thalia never really seems to come around fully on the Hunters as a concept. And despite that, she gives up her life and joins the Hunters in the end, as a way of trying to subvert the prophecy throughout the series, effectively removing her from play and putting all the weight back on Percy. Well, I get the idea this was Thalia making a chess move, sacrificing her own desires to remove herself from play because of the temptation she almost felt throughout other parts of the book to destroy Olympus, thus feeling that if it came down to her having the choice to save or raise, she probably would choose raise. It still feels rushed and confused. Throughout the book, I never really felt like Thalia was being built towards joining the Hunters. Again, the best you could argue is that Riordan made the choice of turning her almost 16 in this book, hinting that she was either going to be the child of prophecy or be taken out of the play soon. It's something that, if you had any medium awareness whatsoever, you'll instantly realize, oh yeah, something's going to happen with her. It feels like bringing Thalia back at the end of the last book was something Riordan did on a whim, and then later came to regret. Because we barely really get a chance to explore Thalia's character at all. It's notable that... Can I help you? It's notable that the one adventure we see her in with Percy is the one where Annabeth, her adopted sister, is absent for almost the entirety of it. We don't really get to explore Thalia as a character. We don't get to see her culture shock. We don't get to see her showing sisterly love to Annabeth. We only get basic surface level stuff of her reacting to Luke's betrayal. We never see her reacting to the news he's evil for the first time, or anger at Luke contrasting Annabeth's desire to redeem him. It would have been interesting to see Annabeth and her fighting over whether Luke needs to die or they could still save him, because it would be much more engaging because these are the two people who knew Luke the best, as opposed to Percy and Annabeth are the ones always clashing on that point. Like I said, it just feels like a wasted character more than anything. And I know Thalia comes back later, but I remember as a kid being really disappointed because Thalia as a character seemed so cool for me. And then being even more disappointed when I read back and realized that Thalia was only in this one book, because she only appears as the punk rock daughter of Zeus in this book. She's a tree in the other two. She was a character I remember really liking as a kid, and then being disappointed that this happened, and that feeling didn't really fade on a reread. It still feels very disappointing. This is what Thalia's ultimate fate is to be. And also weirdly, and oh my god, he's back. Yes. And weirdly enough, I admittedly thought about the prophecy a little too much and how the subversion of it works, to the point I sort of began to question the logistics of it entirely. I mean, Thalia will still turn 16 even as a huntress, right? I mean, technically you could make an argument that Thalia is actually 19 of this book, as she was turned into a tree at the age of 12, which was 7 years ago, in conjunction with this book. But you can at least handwave that as her technically not being half-blood anymore, but a tree. She's not human anymore. There's no part of her that's human, so her turning 19 technically didn't count in that context. But as a huntress, she's still a demigod. She's still half human, half god. She's still the daughter of Zeus. She's just immortal now. She'd still make it to the age of 16, just not physically. So technically, by rights, joining the huntresses shouldn't disclude her from the prophecy. I mean, the prophecies in the series have always been a mix of literal and figurative anyways. So she would still make it to her 16th year, right? In addition, Thalia should have realized the second she was allowed to join the Hunters that the prophecy was never about her. One of the biggest things about Greek prophecies and tragedies, not only in the ancient ones we know about, but the ones in this book as well, is that the prophecies often come about on the road one takes to avoid them.
One often meets his destiny on the road he takes to avoid it.
Thalia should have realized that when she took the oath, the prophecy was never about her and be hit with the biggest case of regret ever. This is at least a little more forgivable in that you can say that it's not an uncommon theme throughout this series that even the gods think they can forever subvert prophecy. But by this point, Thalia had just had an experience that a prophecy will come to pass no matter how hard they try to avoid it. In this book, it says that 5 people will go on a quest and 2 of them will die. They tried to leave with only 4 people, only to find out that Percy was following them all along, thus meaning 5 went on this quest, and guess what? 2 of the people on this quest died in the ways that it is said they were going to die. So Thalia should have realized that she was either going to be the child of prophecy or she wasn't. Joining the Hunters wasn't going to solve that. If anything, joining the Hunters made it more likely she would make it to the age of 16 because she's now immortal and now she's empowered by Artemis. Against all odds, a child of the Big Three will reach 16. I'm definitely overthinking this, but it's just food for thought. All in all, though, I'd give this book about an 8 out of 10. For all my complaints, it's still largely a great book. The Artemis thing is still very weird to me, and it will never not be weird now, but at the same time, I just have to remind myself, it's for kids. The author didn't think that hard on it, so I shouldn't either. The Thalia thing is far more egregious for me, largely because I do feel it's a problem that extends outside the target demographic, because it feels like Riordan regretted the decision to put Thalia back into the story. Not that that might be true, as I could totally make an argument that Thalia is still relevant and she was brought back to show how desperate Kronos is to bring this prophecy about, to the point that he subverts the very concept of killing demigods, as well as proving that what a chess master the Titan and Luke can be, as the entire second book was playing into their hands, reviving another possible candidate of the prophecy even when they beat them, therefore giving them win even when they lost. But overall, I still do think this story... Overall, I do still think this story holds up a lot. And I think that in the long run of things... that I would still recommend going through and rereading it. I do still very much enjoy it, and I can't say it was bad. It's a good reread. I'm glad I still have this on my shelf, and I'm glad that I chose to reread it for this month. Anyways, that being said, that's all I really have to say on the book. Just remember, with every book comes an adventure, and every adventure is worth having, even the bad ones. So later, everyone.